I'd like to invite you to open your Bibles as we continue our series in the book of Mark to Mark chapter 4. If you can open up with me. Mark chapter 4. And Christ, just a review of the last couple weeks, he's just experienced what would have to be one of the most tiring days in his entire life. This day begins in chapter 3, verse 20, and it continues really throughout the end of chapter 4. And remember, he's been fighting these religious leaders, so there's this battle that's been going on. And remember, his family, after hearing all that he was going through, it says in actually chapter 3, verse 21, they went to take charge of him, and they said, he's out of his mind. What's he doing here? It's just his life, his schedule is crazy, and whenever there's tension at home with your family, I'm sure there's some emotional strain in that. So you have the fatigue of all the multitudes around him, and he's given them these different parables, and Christ is tired. He's so tired that he could literally, as we're going to see in today's story, sleep through a storm. I have to admit, I think this might be one of the most underrated miracles in all of Jesus' ministry. I say it's underrated because it reveals an essential element in our relationship with Jesus that most people overlook, and that is the fear of Jesus. I know that sounds kind of strange, doesn't it? Because when we think of Jesus, he's supposed to be meek and mild. And I'm tossing little children up in the air, petting lambs, looking reflectively off into the sunset, his long brown hair blowing in the breeze. Right? We have these mental images of Jesus. And yes, his kindness, his tenderness is amazing. But today we're going to see a different side of Jesus. One every bit as important in our relationship to him. And that is fear. In fact, without the fear of Jesus, you won't find his tenderness that precious or comforting. Now, many people today assume that a God who should be feared would be guilty of some kind of fault. That the fear of God is some kind of leftover relic from some oppressive, archaic view of religion. But any time you are in the presence of greatness, you feel a sense of fear. Now, I got to experience this about 7 years ago. I had the opportunity to play in a benefit fundraiser basketball game for our dear brother who passed away, Scotty Hazel. Now, Scotty was a teacher. He was a coach. He was a praise team member on the drums. He was an author. He was a youth leader. The list could just go on and on. And the basketball game was us and Team Hazel, and we were playing against several current and also ex-players of the Detroit Lions. Now, we had the benefit to take a picture afterwards with some of the players here. And I got to be honest, when I was asked to play on Team Hazel, I felt pretty good. I played high school basketball, even played a year at a small Bible college, and I thought, man, I can hold my own here. And then I stepped on the court, and I was standing next to some of these giants, and I suddenly felt pretty tiny and puny. And like I said, this was the picture that we took afterwards, and these are three Detroit Lions. They were Tahir Whitehead, Devin Taylor, and Bill Bentley. And I'll never forget, you see, the guy who's holding his arms around all of us, his wingspan is probably like 7 foot something, was Devin Taylor. And he came up to me before the game. And he says, I'm going to warn you. What's your name, by the way? And I said, my name's Justin. And he says, when I have the ball, if you are guarding me, I'm going to give you a look, okay, a little wink. And that means I'm going to take the ball to the rim and I'm going to dunk, okay? Now, he says, you have two options. You can either try to be the hero and stay there and take the charge, and I'm going to run over you like a freight train, or you can just step aside, which I think would be wise, and let me do my thing. Now, I thought, thank you so much for the heads up. I'm not stupid. I don't want to end up getting taken off the court in a stretcher, run over by a professional football player, probably be in the news the next day. could get injured, right? But I have to be honest, it was something else just being able to play and see the incredible athletic ability of these professional athletes. I think I'm a pretty decent athlete, but when you play against these guys, and it was a mixture of just an awe of their great athleticism and also terror and fear, right? Now, here is the question. If being in the presence of human greatness makes us feel that way, what is it like to find yourself in the presence of the one who spoke the universe into existence? Have you ever thought of how big and powerful God must be? A couple of summers ago, we were in Utah, and I was amazed at night just to go outside and see the many stars. It was just beautiful. Astronomers say that on the clearest nights, 9,096 stars are visible to the naked eye. And that's out of 3,000 billion trillion stars. That's a 3 with 24 zeros after it. And what's more than that, Isaiah says God knows the name of every single one of them. So he looks out at each of these 3,000 billion trillion stars and says, "Hey, Bob, how you doing? Pegasus, Sirius, how you doing?" And each of these stars puts out the same amount of energy as 500,000 megaton bombs every second, and God created each one of these with just a word. How do you think we're supposed to feel in the presence of God? Watch what happens here in Mark chapter 4. We're going to start with verses 35 and 36. It says, "That day when evening came, he said to his disciples, 'Let us go over to the other side.' Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was in the boats. There were also other boats with him." I'm going to stop here because there is a little textual thing that counters an objection I hear people make more and more often about the Bible. And that is that, oh, this is great, but this is just all a collection of legends. Like, you really believe this? And this idea has been popularized by things like the Da Vinci Code over the years, and the basic gist of the theory goes like this. The first disciples saw Jesus as just a great prophet with a special connection to God, who taught and did some great things, and over time, these stories, they got stretched to include Jesus' divinity, because that made them more powerful. Something like Jesus prayed for someone to get better, and they did, and then it all of a sudden turned out that he healed them. Or Jesus saying, "I really hope that it's going to be good weather for our picnic tomorrow," and that turned in, wow, Jesus controls the weather. It was a beautiful day. Or the original disciples thought Jesus was a voice from God, and later generations wrote that down as Jesus claiming to be Son of God. Now, the reason this theory has become so popular is because people realize the idea that the disciples just made these stories up as direct lies is really unlikely. Mainly because it's hard to establish a sufficient motive for the disciples to do so. You know, when somebody lies, it's because their lies will get them something, right? So a lot of times it's either power or money or something like that. But what did these lies gain the disciples? It didn't get them power. It didn't get them fame or money. What did it bring them? It brought them persecution and death. So this new theory suggests that they didn't grossly lie, but that the stories just got exaggerated over time. And by the time they were written down here, the legend was really indistinguishable from the fact. Now, there are obviously, as you can think, many problems with this theory, but here's one small one. These stories don't read like legends. These stories explicitly claim to be eyewitness accounts, and they read like eyewitness accounts. And one of the evidence that are given little details like these is found in verse 36. You notice where it says, "There were also other boats with him." You ever noticed that before? What does that have to do with anything? Really, nothing. It's just someone recalling what he saw from memory. There are plenty of legends that exist in the first century literature, and none of them read like these. These read like actual eyewitness accounts. Thought that was interesting. Now moving on to verse 37 and 38, it says, "A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat, so it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, 'Teacher, don't you care if we drown?'" Now this must have been some kind of storm, because these are actually experienced fishermen, and they've been through many different storms. Now the Sea of Galilee, where they are, is prone to a lot of storms. It lies 628 feet below sea level. It's surrounded, as you can see, by hills, especially on the east side with its steep cliffs. Now when the cool currents come from Mount Hermon or other hills, and they rush down through the narrow passages between the hills, and they collide with the heated air from the lower levels, violent winds can stir up this lake in a hurry. And the lake, being 13 miles long and 7.5 miles wide, can become a dangerous watery grave. And so this lake is known for its furious, violent winds, especially during the evening hours. Now on this particular night, a crazy storm hits, and Mark calls this a great storm of wind. Now we have, meanwhile, Jesus, who's tired from a tough day of ministry. He has his pillow, and he's trying to catch up on sleep. We know this sleep is intentional because the scripture says he has his cushion. When you have a cushion, you intend to sleep. When I see you bring a neck pillow into the service, I know you've already decided you're not going to make it through my sermon, right? You're planning on falling asleep. So Jesus was planning to sleep. But why is he intending to sleep if he knows that there's a crazy storm that's coming? Surely we know he controls the weather. He knows the weather, so he knows it's coming, and he's planning to sleep through it. You see, this is all a setup. So the disciples, in fear of this, storm, they wake him up with the question. What do they say? "Don't you care, Jesus, if we drown?" Which has to be one of the dumbest questions ever uttered. But you ever feel this way? Jesus, we're about to die. You feel like your life, you're just being overwhelmed, and you think, Jesus, are you sleeping on me? It's like you don't even care. Mark records this story because this is how we often feel in life. So then verse 39 says, "He got up, he rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, 'Quiet, be still.'" Now two amazing things happen here. The first is the words themselves were a command of really utter simplicity, weren't they? He didn't brace himself and roll up his sleeves and raise his magic wand. Jesus simply says, "Quiet, be still." Just as you would talk to an unruly child, right? The more astonishing thing is that the storm obeyed like a compliant child. And here's something else. Be still in Greek is what they call a verb of continuing action, which means he's saying, be quiet and you stay quiet. In other words, he's putting the storm in a timeout, isn't he? He was like, you sit down and I'll tell you when you can come out and play again, storm. He has utter control, and the storm just slinks off into the corner, all sheepish. Verse 39 goes on to say, the wind died down and it was completely calm. Not only did the storm die down immediately, but isn't it interesting that the waves died down? Even if you could miraculously stop the wind immediately, it often takes a couple of hours for the sea itself to calm down, and Jesus did it all at once. And then comes the favorite part of the story. He turns to his disciples and he says in verse 40, "Why are you afraid? Do you still have no faith?" And then it says in verse 41, notice this, it says they were terrified and they asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." Now get this, when they were in the storm, they thought they were going to die. They felt great fear, but this was just plain old regular fear. But after Jesus had rescued them, they were terrified. In other words, the rescue scared them more than the storm. Seeing Jesus' power over the storm was more terrifying than thinking they were going to die in the storm. And they ask in amazement, "Who is this that even the wind and the waves obey him?" When we look at the history, the Jews believed that no one could command the weather but God. I mean, other prophets had possessed the power to heal, but only God, they believed, could control the weather. In fact, in some of the rabbinic literature of the time, like 2 Maccabees, when someone claims to control the weather, they could charge that prophet with blasphemy. Jesus here didn't even call on a higher power to change the weather. He didn't say, God, make this storm stop. He did it himself through his own power. Who is this, they thought? Even the wind and the sea obey him. It has to be God. And you see throughout the book of Mark, he tells us about some amazing things that obey Jesus. You have the story of Jesus healing disease, raising the dead. He commands the demons, and they obey him. And then this one where Jesus commands the weather. And Mark's point is this. If the demons, if disease, if death, and the weather all obey Jesus, then why shouldn't you obey him? So that's a challenge that we have this morning. And I really want to just quickly show 3 important implications that I think we can draw from this story. The first is there is a good kind of fear. Today, a lot of people think the concept of a God you should fear is outdated. But I really think that's just foolish. How could you understand anything about the power of Jesus and not feel fear? Whenever anyone glimpses the power of God in the Bible, it just says they are overcome with fear. I love the example that's found in Revelation chapter 1. When the Apostle John sees Jesus for the first time after he ascended back to heaven. Now keep in mind, John and Jesus are like BFFs. They're good friends while Jesus was on earth. In fact, John in his gospel rather confidently described himself as the one whom Jesus loved, which I always thought took a lot of nerve to put that in print, right? I'm the one Jesus really loved. I'm the one he really liked. So here you can imagine, what is their reunion like? Is it a warm embrace? Is it a high five? Is it a handshake and a slap on the back? Well, I'll read it to you, all right? In John's own words, in Revelation 1:17, he says, "When I saw him, I fell at his feet as though dead. Then he placed his right hand on me and he said, 'Do not be afraid, for I am the first and the last.'" Now, that's not a figure of speech. When he laid his eyes on the glorified Christ, John literally thought he was going to die. So I feel like today we've lost almost all concept of this in our church. Jesus is our homeboy. He's our shepherd snuggling with lost sheep. We sing these sentimental songs about wanting to be in his presence, but realize that if Jesus did what we're asking and he showed up on stage, we would all look like John probably, like we're going to die, right? Which would not be good for church attendance, would it? You see, maybe the reason that so many people are so casual and unmotivated in their obedience is because they have no healthy fear of Jesus. He rebuked the weather, it obeyed. He commanded disease and death, and they yielded. He spoke to demons, and they surrendered. So who are we to disobey his commands? Many people today treat the commands of Jesus so casually. They say, well, I know what he wants, but I'm just not ready for that yet. Or I'll get serious about obeying Jesus when he says later on in my life. Do you know the one to whom you're speaking? Who are we to defy the one who commands and has power over the winds and the waves? Second implication we can draw from this is that fear does not exclude love. Whenever we talk about the fear of God, people object and they say, wait, we're not supposed to fear God. He's the meek, tender, soft, round-haired Savior that plays with children. Yeah, that's great, but I think when there is a proper respect and fear, it really makes his tenderness and love that much more amazing. Remember when I was younger, I was reading C.S. Lewis's book, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And I remember coming to the section in the book where the 4 children first hear about Aslan, the lion who represents Jesus Christ, and that he's coming back to Narnia, and this lion wants to meet the children. Now, when the children first hear his name, They feel this mixture, Lewis says, of mystery and loveliness. And Susan, one of the kids, says, wait, who is Aslan? Mr. Beaver says, why, he's the king. He's the great lion who's the creator of Narnia and is our rightful ruler. And Susan says, a lion? I thought he was a man. Is he quite safe? I shall feel rather nervous about meeting a lion. Safe, said Mr. Beaver. Who said anything about safe? Of course he isn't safe, but he's good. He's the king, I tell you. And I remembered kind of this circular reasoning. I'm 5 years old at the time, or 6, and I'm going around in my head. So I'm talking to Mom and Dad, is he safe or not? And I remember asking them, and my dad said, well, he's not safe because he's a lion, but he's good, and you can trust him, Justin. So he's not safe? My dad said, no, but he's good. So he is safe. I said, no, he's not. He's a lion, Justin. And I'm like, all these thoughts are going through my head, and I was still confused. Yeah. So anyways, let me try to explain, all right, of how I would describe it. And I was thinking through this, and they say that on Mount Everest, at very high altitude, storms can come suddenly within a few seconds. The temperature can literally drop 30 to 40 degrees, accompanied by severe gale force winds. We had friends that went camping in Pentwater over the weekend, and they said it was 85 degrees, and a rainstorm came in, and in about 10 minutes, it dropped from 85 to about 50 degrees. That's 35 degrees in 10 minutes. So you can imagine being at these altitudes, if that happens on Lake Michigan, being caught up in a storm on Mount Everest. The wind effortlessly sweeps, imagine away your equipment. You hear the howl of winds and feel the deep, bone-chilling cold. You know that death is moments away. But just when you're about to give up hope, you notice a small opening in the side of a mountain, leading to a regressed cave. Inside that cave, another traveler's made a fire, prepared a meal. As you sit by the fire, shelter from the storm, you can look back out at the storm, just marveling at its awesomeness and its wonderful power. That storm may no longer be a threat to you, but you still feel a hushed sense of awe of its power. That's the kind of fear the disciples feel before Jesus. Our experience of forgiveness is supposed to, in many ways, intensify our fear and not lessen it. Psalm 130 verse 4 says, but with you there is forgiveness, therefore you are feared. Forgiven so that we might fear? But isn't the point of forgiveness to take my fear away? But if we've really been forgiven, what is there to be afraid of? When we see what Jesus had to go through to save us, it really should make us realize the holiness and perfection of a God who we sinned against. Makes us think of the horrific cross and the terrible price that Christ paid for our sin. This was the price of our disobedience. This is what it was because this is exactly what each one of us deserved. But in that sacrifice that Christ made for us, we also are safe with God's love. And that should really move us to worship. True worship is a mixture of awe and intimacy. Awe at the size and the power of God, and intimacy in realizing He's paid for our sins in full and brought us close to Him. Which leads us to our third and final point here, and that is those who fear Jesus don't need to fear anything else. When you realize how powerful Jesus is and that He is in the boat with you, you won't be afraid of anything else. In this story, after Jesus rebuked the wind and the waves, He also rebukes the disciples for being afraid. And if He's rebuking them, it means they were doing something they shouldn't have been doing. But it seems to me that their fears are legitimate, right? They thought they're going to die. They should be fearful. And Jesus says, yes, but when I'm in the boat with you, even that fear is irrational. I feel like every one of us has had an irrational fear. at one time or another in our lives. It could be a small spider. It could be a closed shower curtain, like is there a murderer on the other side? Or how about flushing those airplane toilets, like you're going to be sucked out of the plane? Or long underground tunnels, or some fear holding babies? I don't know. Mine was swimming in deep water. Even if I was in a swimming pool, if it was over my head, I'd be afraid of sharks and stuff, right? You guys have that? You relate? No, maybe not. Okay. But they're irrational fears. And we all know what it's like to have an irrational fear, but with the presence of Christ in our life, all fears are irrational. Jesus was in their boat. Did they really think he would let them sink? No. So if Jesus was going to make it to the other side and he was in their boat, that meant they would make it to the other side also. But because they didn't understand the power of Jesus over the storm, they feared the storm. But had they feared Jesus, had they understood his power, they wouldn't have been afraid in their lives. Worry in our lives comes from either forgetting the power of Jesus over the storm or doubting his commitment to us while we're going through the storm. And you see, Mark tells the story because it depicts how we often feel in life. We sense these storms brewing around us, and it seems like Jesus is just sleeping. Or maybe you look around and you see the size of the waves coming up over the sides of the boat. They seem overwhelming. And the weather is filling up your boat. You feel like you're drowning. Like, Lord, how am I going to pay my bills? Or how am I going to fix this problem with my kids or my marriage or issues at work? Or, man, my schedule's just so busy. I don't know how I can balance everything. And you ask, how am I going to make it? And you look at Jesus and say, look, do you even care? Aren't you supposed to take care of me? Do you even exist? When you feel that way, I want you to do 3 things. First, realize your feelings of fear are natural. The disciples, they were the future leaders of the church. They felt some of these same fears. But don't listen to your feelings. Put your eyes on Jesus. Put your eyes on his power and his commitment. And then thirdly, when you feel like you're drowning, it's okay to wake Jesus up. Jesus wasn't irritated about being woken up. He was only angered by their lack of faith. So he wants you to wake him up. One last thing that I thought was interesting about this passage, I was very familiar with this. Many of you are probably like, yeah, I've heard this story since I was in Sunday school, since I was a kid. But it dawned on me that this story is told in such a way that reminds us of another prophet who had an incident with the sea in the Old Testament, and that is Jonah. Both Jonah and Jesus were prophets headed towards the Gentiles. The Sea of Galilee, by the way, was the body of water that separated Jew and Gentile territory. And when Jesus crossed it, he was heading to the Gentiles, just like Jonah had been. Both Jesus and Jonah slept through the storm. Both were woken up by scared sailors who asked, "Don't you care?" When Mark says the wind ceased and there was a great calm, that phrase we see in Jonah, when Jonah was thrown into the sea. And here is where it gets really, really interesting. Jonah calmed the storm by plunging himself into it. Jesus calms the storm, however, by speaking to it. And that's because this was not the place for Jesus to plunge himself into the sea. You see, throughout Scripture, the sea represents God's wrath. At the cross is where Christ would plunge himself into the sea of God's wrath, where he would be swallowed up by death for how many days? 3 days, just like Jonah was swallowed by the fish. The wrath of God was terrible. It was like a raging sea. Greater than we could ever comprehend. It would have destroyed us. But Jesus faced the terror and silenced it in love. And that should lead us to worship. Matthew even says, in his gospel, Jesus said this, "One greater than Jonah is here." And who's Christ referring to? Himself. He says, "I'm the true Jonah." He meant that someday he was going to calm the storm, still all the waves. I'm going to destroy destruction, break brokenness, kill death. How could he do that? He can do it only because when he was on that cross, he was thrown willingly, like Jonah, into that storm, under the waves of sin and death. And that storm ultimately calmed when his head bowed and he gave that ultimate sacrifice for each one of us. If you recall when Jesus went to the cross, the real sea of God's wrath, we were really sleeping on him. Peter, James, John, they represented us. They slept while Jesus stayed awake to face the wrath of God while we slept. He always has been, always is, always will be wide awake through our storms and suffering. He's always in perfect control. But here's the question. Who really got woken up in the story? Who was it? It wasn't Jesus. He knew what was going to happen from the very beginning. The disciples got woken up by his power and his love. So let's bow together this morning. Just challenge ourselves. Could it be the storm in your life today that's there to wake you up to Christ and his wonderful power?